So now it's recording. Hi, Mom. This is, I'm going to attempt to read this book and record it. Teresa of Avila, the book of my life that we're reading together, translated by Mirabai Starr, so that you can listen to me read it and watch me read it. Not that you have to watch me. You're going to follow along to the words in the book, as we've been doing over the phone and in person. So, through the miles to you, and looking forward to book club in a couple of weeks. All right. Or it's next week, actually, right? Okay. So we were at chapter 15, the prayer of quiet. Now let's get back to our subject, which always seemed to be a little bit difficult for Saint Teresa to do so. She seemed to get sidetracked quite a bit. But the satisfaction and serenity the soul experiences at this deeper stage of prayer are signs of the quietude and recollection God has bestowed on her. These feelings are accompanied by a sense of profound contentment and calm, as well as a gentle joy that permeates the faculties. Since this is the furthest the soul has ever traveled, she thinks she has nothing left to strive for. Like St. Peter, she would gladly make her dwelling there. The soul in this state hardly dares to move or stir for fear that this delight will slip through her fingers. Sometimes she is afraid to even breathe. The poor little thing doesn't realize that just as there was nothing she could do to obtain this blessing by her own efforts, she is even less capable of holding on to it longer than the Lord desires her to have it. I have already mentioned that in this initial recollection and quietude, the faculties of the soul do not cease functioning. But the soul is content just to abide with God, so the calm and quietude endure as long as the recollection lasts. The other faculties may be distracted, but the will is in union with God. Gradually, the will draws the intellect and memory back into a state of recollection. Even though the will is not yet totally absorbed, it is so thoroughly engaged with what it doesn't really know, that no matter how hard the other faculties may try, they cannot steal its joy and contentment. In fact, with hardly any effort, the will helps keep this tiny spark of love for God from going out. May His Majesty be pleased to give me the grace to explain this clearly, because a multitude of souls enter this state, but few transcend it. I don't know whose fault that is. It certainly isn't God's. What I do know is that once His Majesty has granted a soul the blessing of attaining the prayer of quiet, He will not fail to give her many more favors unless she herself rejects His mercy. It is very important for the soul to realize the immense dignity of this state. The Lord has done her an incredible favor to bring her to the prayer of quiet. She sees that she no longer belongs wholly to this earth, because the Beloved, in His great goodness, is about to make her a citizen of heaven. That is, as long as she doesn't try to stop Him. Too bad for her if she turns back. If she does, I think she will slide all the way to the bottom. This is where I would have ended up if the Lord hadn't rescued me. Serious transgressions lead the soul into this downward spiral. Only the blindness induced by evil could cause the soul to forfeit such goodness. So if His Majesty has favored you so highly that you have attained this state, I beg you, for the love of God, know yourself. With humble and holy confidence, hold yourself in high esteem. Otherwise, you will be tempted to return to the slave food of Egypt. But if weakness, wickedness, and misery cause you to fall as I fell, always bear in mind the good you have lost. You would be correct to lose some trust in yourself. Stand in holy awe. If you give up the practice of prayer, you will only go from bad to worse. I consider it a real calamity when people begin to despise the path that has led them to do so much good. These are the ones to whom I'm speaking. I'm not saying that they may never again forsake God or commit any transgressions. Even though there are plenty of good reasons why those who have begun to receive these blessings should be on their guard against sin, I acknowledge that we are all human. All I am saying is that they should never stop praying. Contemplative prayer teaches us to be mindful of what we are doing. It inspires us to seek reconciliation with our God. It helps us to draw the strength we need to elevate our souls. We must believe that if we abandon the path of prayer, we are flirting with grave danger. This is just my opinion. I'm not sure if I even understand what I'm saying. All I have to go on is my own experience. The prayer of quietude is a little spark of true love that the Lord begins to ignite in the soul. He wants the soul to understand the joyous nature of this love. Anyone who has experienced the prayer of quietude will immediately agree that this sacred spark is not something you can grasp for ourselves. Human nature tends to be greedy. We cling to any moment of delight, but no matter how desperately we may wish to kindle the blaze and bask in holy delight, all we end up doing is dousing the fire, leaving our souls cold. The deep quietude and recollection that accompanies the prayer of quiet are good indicators that this little spark, no matter how small it may be, is from God, and not the spirit of evil. Nor is it a delight that we have fabricated for ourselves. As long as we don't extinguish it with our own imperfection, this spark will ignite the great fire, spreading the same flames of passionate God-love that we observe blazing in advanced souls. This little spark is a sign of God's promise that He has chosen the soul for great things. It is her choice whether or not she will prepare herself to receive His gifts. And this state of prayer is a great gift that I can ever express. And this state of prayer is a greater gift than I can ever express. It makes me very sad to see how many souls attain this high state, and yet how few ever go beyond it. I'm ashamed to mention it. I shouldn't say that there only are few. There must be many, because God wouldn't sustain us for no reason. I'm only referring to what I've witnessed. For those souls who have reached this state, I have some advice. Take care not to hide your talents. It seems that God has chosen you to be of service to others. This is especially important in times like these, when strong friends of God are needed to support the weak ones. You who recognize this gift in yourself may consider yourself to be a friend of God, as long as you abide by the rules that govern a good friendship, even in the world. If not, watch out. You might bring harm to yourself, and God forbid, to others as well. I like that she's equating this to friendship with God. All the soul needs to do during these times of quietude is to be still and make no noise. What I mean by noise is rushing around with the intellect, trying to rustle up reflections of gratitude and words of praise for the gift you are being given. Which is kind of funny because she interrupts her writing so much to praise God. Anyway. It's that impulse of the mind to catalog your transgressions, to convince yourself that you do not deserve to receive such grace. It's that commotion the faculties create, the intellect trying to conjure up images and the memory rushing to store them. These faculties wear me out. I may have a poor memory, but sometimes I seem to be incapable of subduing it. The will needs to understand, calmly and wisely, that we cannot force God to do what we want. Any effort to do so would be like carelessly piling huge logs onto a fire and smothering it. The will ought to acknowledge its powerlessness and simply say, Lord, what is my rightful place here? What does the devotee have to do with the Master? What is the relationship of earth to heaven? Or it can speak any other words of love that occur to it in these moments as long as they are rooted in truth. But the will should ignore the intellect. The mind is nothing more than a grinding mill at this time. The rushing noise, the intellect trying to rustle up reflections of gratitudes and words of praise for the gift you are being given. Impulse of the mind to catalog your transgressions. And then here she writes the grinding mill. The mind is nothing more than a grinding mill at this time. The will may have an irresistible urge to share the joy it is experiencing with the intellect. It may strive to bring the mind into a state of recollection. Often during the prayer of quiet, the will is in serene union with the divine, while the mind wanders around aimlessly. It is better for the will to leave the intellect alone than to chase after it. All that the will needs to do now is remain in recollection like a wise bee and simply enjoy the gift. For if all the bees were always zipping around trying to bring the others into the hive, no bees would actually be inside the hive doing the important work of making honey. If the soul does not take care in this matter, she risks losing a great deal. The more developed the intellect, the bigger the danger. Once the soul launches its search for concepts and starts composing little speeches, she convinces herself that she is doing something important. especially if she comes up with pretty ideas and words to express them. The soul needs to recognize that there is absolutely no reason that God should grant us this mercy other than His great goodness. She should be aware that she is very near His Majesty and take this opportunity to ask for His continued blessing. She should also pray for the whole of the spiritual community and include those who have asked for her prayers and also those who have died. She should not use a lot of noisy words, but quietly express her yearning to be heard. More important things are unfolded in this simple prayer than in 1,000 big ideas generated by the intellect. When the will spontaneously realizes its spiritual growth, it quickens with a fire of love. This inspires it to engage in loving acts toward the one to whom it owes so much. It does all of this without involving the noisy intellect, which is busy searching for grand concepts. Yes, I must admit, my brain does that. If we place a tiny twig of humility on this fire of love, we are doing far more to intensify the blaze than if we were to feed it 100 huge logs of discursive reasoning. While we might think we are being erudite, we would only snuff the flame in less time than it takes to recite the creed. This is especially useful advice for the learned men who ordered me to write this. Surely, through the goodness of God, you will attain this high state of prayer at some point. You might be inclined to apply biblical interpretations to spiritual experiences. Your studies may be of tremendous benefit before and afterward, but in the midst of contemplative prayer, education is irrelevant. In fact, all of your theological concepts may only serve to cool the fire of love in the will. At times like these, I find that my intellect is so close to the light that it sees everything with incomparable clarity, and I, though I am what I am, seems to be someone else altogether. And I, though I am what I am, seem to be someone else altogether. Now she brings up the great I am here. Ordinarily, I hardly understand any of the liturgy in Latin, least of all the Psalms. But when I am in this state of quietude, I not only understand the prayers as if they were written in Spanish, but I even go beyond this to rejoice in the meaning that transcends all language. Yeah, that's right. Forgot, they only use Latin for Mass. I'm not talking about the occasions when learned men need to preach or teach. In that case, their studies are a good thing, because they help poor people like me who have little education of their own. It is always a good thing to offer charity and sustain compassion toward all souls, as long as the caring comes from a simple place and is dedicated to God. When the gift of quietude comes to learned men, they should put all learning aside and simply rest in the stillness. The time will come when their knowledge will be useful to the beloved. Then they will value their education so highly that they would not trade it for any treasure. All they will want is to use it in the service of His Majesty. Believe me, in the presence of infinite wisdom, a little study of humility and a few humble acts are worth more than all the knowledge in the world. In the prayer of quiet, there is no room for rational argument. All that is required is that we know exactly who we are. We must simply place ourselves in the presence of God. He seems to want to strip us of our reason and render us utterly foolish. Indeed, His Majesty humbles Himself so radically that He allows fools to come near Him. But the intellect is still activated and moved to articulate ardent prayers of gratitude. The will, on the other hand, is very calm, and like the publican, keeps its eyes lowered. In this quiet way, the will expresses its thanks far more clearly and fully than does the intellect with all its fancy rhetoric. There is no reason in this state to renounce all forms of discursive meditation or even vocal prayer. Yet if the quietude is deep enough, the soul will find herself practically incapable of speaking anyway, at least not without a great deal of painful effort. I believe it is possible for us to discern whether this quietude comes from the Spirit of God or whether we are picking up the devotional impulse God gave us originally and trying to harness it ourselves to achieve the state we desire. Remember, if we struggle to attain the prayer of quiet by our own effort, it doesn't work. What little serenity we eke out dissipates quickly and leaves us feeling dry. I also think that an experienced seeker will tell the state of quietude. I also think that an experienced seeker can tell if the state of quietude comes from the spirit of evil. If that's the case, it will lack the characteristic humility and will leave the soul feeling agitated. It contributes nothing to preparing the soul to receive the efforts that the genuine prayer of quiet, given directly by God, engenders. It neither illumines the intellect nor fortifies the will. As long as the soul follows the directive to fix her thoughts and desires on God, directing the goodness and delight she experiences to Him alone, the spirit of evil can do her little or no harm. Not only will the spirit of evil gain nothing in this way, but the joy that God arouses in the soul will be taken away from the spirit of evil in equal measure. Since the soul believes that her delight comes from God, she is filled with longing for Him and motivated to seek Him again and again through contemplative prayer. If she is a humble soul and more curious about the cross than about spiritual rewards, she won't pay attention to the comforts offered by the spirit of evil. But when the consolation comes from the Spirit of God, the soul will be incapable of ignoring it and will hold it in the highest esteem. Once the spirit of evil notices that the soul has humbled herself in every aspect of prayer, it will have to admit that it has lost the game and will stop coming around to bother her. Remember when I was talking about the first water, which represented the first stage of prayer? I pointed out how important it is for beginners on the path to begin cultivating detachment from sensory gratifications right from the start. They should enter a life of prayer determined to help Christ carry His cross, like faithful warriors who are dedicated to the task of serving their King with no concern about compensation, secure in the knowledge of their ultimate reward. All they need do is keep their eyes fixed on the true and everlasting kingdom we are all striving to attain. The same kind of concentration is required here. We always need to hold this kingdom in our minds, at least at the beginning. As we advance on the path, we will not have to strive so hard to remember all the things are impermanent, that everything is nothing, and that any refuge we find here on earth is not real refuge at all. Eventually, we will discover that sometimes we need to forget these things and simply live. Detachment in and of itself is a lowly goal. Spiritual adepts would consider it insulting if someone suggested that they give up the pleasure of the world. Simply because. Spiritual adepts would consider it insulting if someone suggested that they give up the pleasures of the world simply because these things will come to an end. Even if such pleasures were to last forever, advanced souls would gladly give them up for God. In fact, the more evolved these souls have become and the more enduring the pleasures they are offering up for God, the happier they are. For souls like these, love has intensified to such a degree that it takes over everything. Love does all the work. But for beginners, this advice about consciously cultivating detachment is of the utmost importance, and this is why I make such a point of it. Beginners should not dismiss this counsel, but rather trust that following it will lead them to great good. Even souls who have already attained a high state of prayer may sometimes find themselves being tested by God to such an extent that they begin to wonder if His Majesty is giving up on them. When this happens, they will also find this teaching useful. Don't forget, the growth of the soul is not exactly like the growth of the body. I mean, the soul does grow, but it obeys different rules. Once a child has become an adult and developed a strong body, he doesn't shrink and become small again. But the Beloved does allow this to happen to the soul. The only way I know this is that I've seen it myself. I suppose the purpose of this is to humble us for our own greater good and to remind us not to become careless in this state of exile. The higher we ascend, the more closely we must pay attention, and the less we must rely on our own devices. The time comes when even the most radically surrendered souls must protect themselves against offending God. Their wills are so aligned with the will of God that they should rather be tortured and die 1,000 deaths than commit a single imperfection. Still, they are sure to find themselves at some point or another being attacked by temptations and persecutions. When this happens, they need to pull out the first weapon of prayer and remember that everything is impermanent, that all things come to an end, and that there is life after death. In this way, they will avoid spiritual error. Let's review what I've been saying. When we start off determined to follow the way of the cross and refuse to be lured by the craving for consolation, we build a solid foundation and protect ourselves against the tricks the spirit of evil uses to deceive us. After all, the Beloved himself pointed in this way of perfection when he said, "Take up your cross and follow me." He is our example. Whoever walks in his footsteps with a sole desire of pleasing him has nothing to fear. Such souls will begin to detect improvement in themselves and will be able to recognize that these positive effects are not the work of the spirit of evil. When these souls fall, they quickly get back up because the Lord is with them. Here are some other signs of God's presence. When it is the Spirit of God that induces a deep quietude, the soul has no need for manufacturing feelings of humility and unworthiness. The Beloved himself gives this gift of prayer in such a way that it transcends anything we could achieve through our nice little rationalizations. Self-mortification is nothing compared to the true humility that springs to light when the Lord shines on us. This produces a revelation that totally undoes us. The sudden awareness that we are nothing is a gift from God. The experience is not uncommon, and the more bountiful we are blessed, the deeper this awareness grows. God fills us with an intense desire for spiritual transformation and the determination not to give up on prayer, no matter how severely we may be tested. We are willing to suffer anything that comes our way. While standing in humility and trepidation, we are simultaneously certain that we will be liberated. This conviction banishes all servile fear and replaces it with holy awe. We have matured and grown in faith. We become conscious of the stirrings of a love for God that is free of self-interest. We crave periods of solitude and silence so that we may be more deeply savor. We crave periods of solitude and silence so that we may more deeply savor this grace. I'm getting tired now, as am I, so I will try to wrap this up. The prayer of quietude is the beginning of all blessings. The soul clearly sees that the flowers in her garden have been given everything they need to burst into blossom. She is incapable of believing that the Beloved is not with her until she turns back to see the flaws and imperfections in herself, and then she grows afraid. This fear can be a good thing, but some souls benefit more from the simple belief that God is with them always than from any combination of fears that might strike them. If it is a person's nature to be loving and grateful, then merely remembering a blessing she has received will do more to bring her back to God than reflecting on all the possible punishments of hell. At least this was true in my case, wicked though I may be. Later I will more fully describe the signs of the good spirit. For now, it is too difficult for me to explain them adequately. I believe that by the grace of God, I will find a way to convey what he means me to say. While I trust in my own experience because I have reflected on it so thoroughly and have understood so much of what it has to teach me, I also have the added benefit of having consulted with some very learned men. These are holy people who are worthy of our respect. With resources like these available, souls who have reached this stage through the goodness of God may not have to weary themselves to the brink of death as I did. All right, so I'm going to stop there, Mom. And this is 23 minutes long to read that chapter, so it's going to take a little bit to download onto YouTube. So I'll try to, when I read this, read it out loud to you, and hope you enjoy it, and give love and hugs to Peter and Mariam, and a nice pet to Silas, who I haven't met yet, and know that I'm giving you my love always, and to my dear brother and his dear wife. Okay, love you all.